Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Adler, and I'm director of the Ethics and Journalism Initiative here at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited about this event. I'm often moderating. I'm really looking forward to actually being in the audience because I can't wait to hear the panel. Quick thing about the Ethics and Journalism Initiative, if you don't know, we started last year. And we've been putting on events and workshops. So we provide one-on-one mentoring to NYU students. So if you're not aware of that program and you're an NYU student, please take advantage of it. We also have a website, ethicsandjournalism.org, which Ryan Housel edits. Ryan is here, right here. And it's got great resources and articles on journalism ethics, so I really recommend you take a look at it. For the first time, we're sponsoring a journalism award. It's a brand new award called the Peter F. Collier Award for Ethics in Journalism. There's a student category, and you're eligible for it. There's a student, local, and national category with first prizes of $5,000, $10,000, and $15,000. The deadline is December 9th, so this would be a good time to think about applying for that award as well. Let me introduce Corinne Perkins, who's then going to introduce the panel, and we'll be talking about ethics in photojournalism. I worked with Corinne for years at Reuters. She's one of my favorite editors I've ever worked with. Corinne is North American Pictures editor, and in that role, she oversees over 100 staff and freelance photojournalists, as well as photo editing staff. She started actually at the Sydney Olympics in 2000 for Reuters, ended up going on to Singapore and then Toronto, and we were fortunate to bring her to New York when this role opened, and it's just been such a delight to work with her. So let me turn it over to Corinne to introduce the panel, and I'm going to go take a seat. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Steve. You guys can all hear me? Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for allowing us to be here. It's going to be a very casual conversation. That's how I do it. So, if you need to interject, then go for it. But I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. So on the left, we have Sandra Stevenson, who's an award-winning writer, visual editor, curator in the photography department at the Washington Post. As a deputy director of photography, she manages a team of picture editors who work on international, climate, and health and science. Prior to joining the Post, Sandra was an associate deputy director of photography at CNN, where she managed picture editors who curated the home screen, edited stories and newsletters, as well as special projects. Prior to that, she was an assistant editor who oversaw digital photo editors on the news desk and worked on visual content for race-related and the gender, in addition to exclusive projects such as Overlooked and This Is 18. She also previously worked at NBC, the Black Filmmaker Foundation, and the Associated Press, where she oversaw photo news coverage for Latin America and the Caribbean. She holds a BA in English from Syracuse University. Next up, we'll go to Victor. Victor is a New York-based photojournalist whose work is most often concerned with the legacy of armed conflict, human rights, and the protection of civilian populations, and unequal outcomes resulting from policy and politics. He has worked in Central America since 2002, concentrating on social conflict in Guatemala, and since 2009 has photographed the counterinsurgency war in Afghanistan. He has completed assignments in Syria, Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, Iraq, and India, and has documented news stories and social issues across the US. He worked as a staff photographer at The Record in Stockton, California, and holds a master's degree in visual communication from Ohio University. His photographs have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Harper's Bazaar, The New York Times Magazine, Bloomberg, and Business Week, Sports Illustrated, USA Today, basically everywhere that you can have a picture.
Washington Post.
The Washington Post. If you don't know Victor's pictures, you haven't been looking because they're absolutely everywhere. Next up is Julie Jacobson. Julie is a seasoned photo editor at the Associated Press, a globally recognized news organization, which I'm sure you all know. She joined the AP in San Francisco as a staff photographer in 2001 and was based in New York for 8 years before transferring to Las Vegas in 2009. In 2014, she returned to New York City. She earned a degree in journalism from the University of Kansas in 1992 and began her career as a photojournalist at the Kansas City Star shortly after. Jacobson was embedded with the US Marines and the Army in Iraq in 2003 and 2004, and also did 2 tours with the military in Afghanistan in 2009 and 2010. A native of Overland Park, Kansas, Jacobson has traveled internationally and around the US, covering headlining news stories such as the Haiti earthquake and the gun debate in the US. Jacobson's work also focuses on various premier sporting events such as the Olympics, World Cups, golf majors, the World Series, and the Super Bowl. She is known for her ability to make strategic decisions under tight deadlines, ensuring the delivery of high quality and impactful images that resonate with audiences worldwide. So welcome to the panel, and we're gonna switch to the first slide. Oh, which is us. There you go. And now we can switch to the next slide. So, and I should warn all of you, as is the nature of this work, there will be some graphic images that are displayed. Not on this one, really, but some of the future slides will show graphic images. So we figured it would be a good starting point to talk through politics coverage, obviously in light of the election. And I wanted to start with Julie, who is at the AP, and this picture by Evan Vucci is probably one of the most emblematic pictures of this year. So I wanted to ask Julie, what are the discussions that you can speak to us about at the AP about a picture like this and the life that it leads after it's taken?
Is this on? Hello? Oh, it is on. Well, a life that this leads after it's already taken, it went very, very far, as I'm sure you all have seen, not just in publications, but I think you all saw them on some campaign signs as well, which was kind of a bit of a shock in a way to me. Situations like this, they happen very quickly, and you have to credit, not just Evan, but all the photographers who were down there at that time. They just did what they had to do. They didn't even think of their own safety. Bullets were probably still flying that way, and they're still focused on the former president, or current president-elect now. And at that point, I know for a fact that, especially through the campaign season, we have photographers are shooting. We have editors who are editing remotely. So the photographers are pushing pictures wirelessly directly through the cameras into a server. And that's how these images get out that quickly. So there's really not, especially, I think it was a weekend, wasn't it? Yeah, it was a weekend. So there's not a lot of people around. There's not a lot of room for discussion. It's your editors are making spot decisions, what pictures to move. And I wasn't the remote editor at the time, but it's, we have a global photo desk as well that monitors things. They are also looking for standards, making sure we're meeting standards and not violating any of those. And this is, that picture itself is pretty clear cut. There's a little bit of a graphic nature to it, but not much more than, the streak of blood down his face if I were to get detailed. And it's an important moment. This is a former president who's campaigning to be president again. Someone took a shot at him. It's news. You got to move that. It's important. He's going to be a public, elected official. He had been an elected official. He's a public figure. He's in a public space. There's no privacy issues here. People need to know. It's not just about freedom of the press. It's about what you, as a voter, as a citizen of this country, what you need to know. And whenever you come up across situations like this or anything similar, you think about all of those things. The public nature of it or the private nature of it. And you balance those things out. I mean, this was happening so fast. I mean, even the other photographer who was what we call the backstand, he was shooting too. He was pushing pictures as well. And you had like one guy editing everything, and he's making all these snap decisions. So I'm not sure how much discussion happened at that point, but it's all kind of going on in your head, all these little what I call micro adjustments that you don't even think about. You don't even know that you're making them. You just do them, and you make that decision very snap to push it out. And then, after the fact, I think Evan went through his outtakes and put, the rest of them in the archives, very carefully going through everything. They go in, somebody else checks them before everything else goes out. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. And has there been discussion since the picture has been taken and we send photographers to Trump events and that picture is everywhere. It's printed on bonnets, it's printed on shoes. Has there been discussion?
Yeah, I know there's discussion in DC. I'm not based in DC, so I'm not there every day. But I do know that, like, I have discussions with our photographers here. When he came to an event, I think it was at Nassau Coliseum, and I always remind the photographers, yes, it's about speed, but remember, you do not take your lens off the presidential candidate or the president himself. You never take it off. Don't worry if the signal isn't good and you can't get a picture out while he's still speaking. Do not take that off. Somebody already took a shot at him, and somebody had just been arrested that week for, walking around Mar-a-Lago with a gun. So, so because sometimes it's easy to just kind of forget that photographers, and I've been there myself, you just kind of get caught up in, I got to get this out now, speed, and you forget, you forget, why exactly you're there. You're there to cover a president, not just the speaking, but, for writers, you can always go back and get your quotes and talk to people later, but a photographer has to be there when it happens. You have to be on it.
And I wanted to ask Victor about exactly that. Like, when you're in these situations, how do you keep yourself safe, keep your eye on the picture, and what goes through your mind when you're covering Trump, whether it's in the courthouse or out in a rally, or your other picture inside the Capitol there?
Well, I mean, I totally agree with Julie. It's like, it's hard to focus on. I wish all editors had your attitude about worry about speed after the picture. I wish, because I get a lot of messages on my phone or in my ear if I have a earpiece in, like, where are the pictures? Send. And I actually want the first time I ever photographed the president when I was in Stockton. Bush came through town in 2006. And there was a guy from the Sacramento Bee, and we went to the airport and he did the wave goodbye, goes up the plane, goes up the stairs, plane starts taxiing, everybody else packs up, and the photographer had a 600, a huge long lens, and was trailing the plane as it went in the distance. And I was like, what are you doing, man? And he was like, what if that plane blows up? I would never forgive myself if I didn't have that picture. And he watched it until it was gone. And I was like, that's a pro. I'm an amateur. That guy's a pro. But no, I mean, I think the situational awareness, even though that's kind of a technical term, the kind of more colloquial term for it is street smarts, learning how to read your environment and be able to tell as the kids say, the vibe, what's happening, and being able to recognize changes. That's the important thing, is when the mood changes, when the temperature goes up or goes down, and being able to kind of keep a constant tally of that in the back of your mind. And, when you talk about safety stuff, for me, keeping those things in consideration is not a way to go through the world paranoid or afraid or constantly on the lookout for something. He's going to do something to me. It's the opposite. When I'm tracking when I'm paying attention to my situational awareness, when I'm constantly taking the temperature of a situation, it makes me feel more confident to keep working. It helps communicate to me what I need to be paying attention to and what I don't need to be paying attention to right now. Keeps me focused and makes me feel I'm more prepared and more capable. These situations they can get fluid. A lot of stuff is, the Trump rally is an amazing example. I wasn't there. The assassination attempt, where a kind of scripted sort of scene suddenly goes dramatically off script. That kind of happens. I was in the Capitol on January 6th, and that was a situation where it was a more slow moving, going off the script. Literally, it took from the ellipse to the west steps of the Capitol for it to go completely off script. But once it did, it went way off script. And so again, you're just taking the temperature and adjusting as it goes and determining. It's also kind of good to know, to have some sort of sense of yourself, to have a little bit of experience, and to have a pretty clear idea of I think about it as what's your threat tolerance? What's your tolerance for threat? I have a pretty good idea of what mine is. and I know when I need to pause and back up, or I know when I need to push, I think that comes with experience, but it's not only experience, it also comes with a little bit of self-awareness. And I think it pays for photographers to spend a little bit of time thinking about, and I know a lot of photographers who get into their first situation where it's kinetic, dynamic, maybe a little bit dangerous, and they realize pretty quickly, this is not for me. And that's an amazing moment for a person. That's what's called professionalism, is learning that about yourself and knowing like where your limits are. And that keeps people from getting hurt, I think.
Thanks, Victor. And Sandra, when you're assigning this sort of thing, is it a consideration in terms of safety training, who you send out there? What experience level do they have? How do you consider that when you're assigning?
I think in this day and age, all of those things have to come into play. It's not just about, oh, we're going to send a photographer to cover a protest, or, I think after January 6th, I think we knew that things had shifted, in terms of how we cover campaigns and how we cover candidates in general. And so we then decided that we needed to make sure that anyone who was going to go out on the campaign trail also had, civil disobedience training and HEFAT training. And, I honestly would, if you had asked me 10, 20 years ago, is combat training or that sort of training necessary? And I would have said, oh no, only if you're going overseas to cover, a conflict. But now you really just don't know. And I would even include covering natural disasters. We now even have training for, when we're sending photographers to cover post, hurricane or post tornado. It's really important that we take whoever we're sending out there, whether they're staff or freelancer, into consideration. We do want to think about their safety. We do want to think about their mental health. Afterwards, we did have a staff photographer cover that unfortunate situation with Trump when the assassination attempt happened. And of course, Jabin filed the pictures, which was great. But immediately after, it was all about, all right, we need to make sure that, this person has whatever he needs to decompress, the people he needs to talk to. We made sure that, that was available to that person if needed. And even for the editors on the desk, I know that photographers are constantly out there on the street and also on the front line, but, as photo editors, when you're sitting there taking in all of these images from not just domestic coverage, but overseas coverage, it really does have an impact. We also need, as editors, to think about, when we're putting people in these situations. And so we have, as Corinne and I were talking earlier, we have begun to open up this sort of training even for editors so that they can begin to understand and be able to ask pertinent questions when they're sending someone out. But, to get back to your main question, which is, yes, we do take all of those things into consideration when we're sending people out to cover various stories.
So how does one get training?
Wow. Well, there are various organizations like IWMF that offer training throughout the US and actually I think throughout the globe. I think I saw a couple of training sessions in Africa and in Europe. They also offer scholarships for that. Some news organizations, if you have a really great relationship with them, some news organizations will find a way to help, team you up with the company or with whatever the news organization uses. Like we have our own sort of security team that we work with that handles the training. But there are definitely opportunities out there for freelancers, and definitely opportunities, for financial assistance to, help you mitigate the pricing for that.
Yeah, and the IWMF, the Dart Center, there's a bunch of really good ones as well.
Corinne, let me just
Yeah.
interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
So actually AP's head of security is coming here on December, say 4th to do a security session with anybody who wants to come. So we'll announce that, but just since we're talking about it, you should know we try every semester to do one. And this is Kerry Patterson, who's at AP, and I know she knows a lot about it and has directed people in this area. So if you're interested in that, watch the announcement. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's perfect. And just as an aside with the January 6th picture from Leah Millis, I always say it helps to have somebody on your staff that is a worst case scenario person. She's great to, what are we doing about nuclear war? Like, I'm not going to cover it. I'm done. But, she really prepared us for January 6th. She was very aware that this could go south. She had all of her PPE on, and that picture was taken by her climbing the inauguration scaffolding. And to Julie's point earlier that, not like text journalists or other people, we can't go back to that moment. At 4 p.m. that day, I got a call from our general manager. We couldn't get in touch with anybody. Should we pull out all the photographers? Because our gear was getting smashed. There was a lot of violence, and there was a real danger to them. And I couldn't contact anybody, but I said no, because if we're not there, people don't know what happened. And this picture was taken at 5:02 p.m. And, alongside a lot of pictures from that day has become really emblematic of what happened. And if we're not there to show the world what's happening, how do they know what happened? So that leads me to my next question. We're looking at a second Trump presidency. So, how do you guys take what you've learned from the first Trump presidency to cover the second one? I'm going to start with you, Julie.
How do we say the question, how do we take what we
How do we take what we learned from the first Trump presidency into the next Trump presidency? And, I'm sure there's lots of discussions about how we cover the next 4 years.
Wow, if I were just to take my back conversations, just the how you holding up question from DC. Yeah, he's quite a dynamic figure to cover, and I think it's going to be really interesting. I think we're going to, first of all, we're going to cover the president as we always do, as we always cover a president. We go everywhere with him, but he's so kind of unpredictable in a way that you just can't know everything he's going to do. I know that we have people there. I don't want to say on call, but there's always someone there at the White House every single day, even on Sundays, just in case the president decides to get up and go somewhere or do something. It's really about paying attention, very close attention to the news, everything that, not just what he says every day, but what he does, even right now, all the appointments that he's making for his cabinet. Those are all very interesting. Every day he makes an appointment, the stock market goes up or down, because every single one of those people has some kind of an effect on, say, like healthcare, with Kennedy's appointment. All of those little vaccine, all the pharmaceutical companies, all the supportive, suppliers, all of that went up and went down with his appointment. So it's about really paying attention, not just to Trump himself, but to what I call the extremities around him. Even Elon Musk is an interesting figure to look at. I think to myself, we're in the post, after his first presidency, just being in here in New York, and you have all these people who were affiliated with him, under some kind of federal charges of, some sort of corruption or fraud. And I look ahead and I keep wondering, is that going to continue? So, there's all these things that you have to kind of pay attention to, other than, his national policy, his international policy, how the wars are going to play out in Israel or Ukraine, because of his different stances on NATO and, who should be paying for what and who he does or doesn't support. How do you cover the president? Well, you kind of take what you already know what to do, and then you're just going to have to adjust with him. I think when Biden, became president 4 years ago, it was sort of like this this relief. Everybody was able to exhale a little bit, and things sort of went back to what we normally do. And I think with Trump coming back, it's just we're gonna look back to what we did, or everything that we didn't know back then, and we're gonna be better prepared for it this time.
Thanks, Julie. What about you guys, Sandra? Discussions at the post?
Yeah, we, have a photographer at the White House, every single day. But I think our coverage of Trump and even Harris before the election occurred really was kind of what Julie mentioned, which is, you're not just covering the candidate, but you're covering all the people around them because you don't know which of those folks are actually either going to make news, become the news, be part of the cabinet. As we prepare for, his taking over the presidency, the Post has tons of conversations around, not just how are we covering him, but what are we covering? How are we covering particularly policies as it pertains to, things that impact everyday people? And again, as he goes out or as, he continues to name his cabinet or his main people, um, you know, the hunt for looking for those types of images becomes even more important, um, at times difficult because some of the folks that he's appointing are people who aren't normally photographed. And so we then have to have conversations around like, how are we going to illustrate, that person because there are only two photos that exist of this person. So it really becomes sort of a challenge. And I think, I don't know that we know what to expect in a way when he takes office. I think we did see, what happened in his first presidency, but I don't know that we know. And I think we are just kind of going to play it by ear as best as we can. But I think as far as staffing and making sure that we're on top of the stories, that we know are meaningful to people and important to audience, we will continue to stay on top of that and assign photographers to cover those things. But I think that's going to be a mystery, and I think it's going to be an interesting challenge for all of us in the media. Like, how are we going to, especially, he's made it very clear that he's a little bit hostile to the media, and so then it becomes this weird dance of, we've got to cover this person, but how do we cover that person objectively? Do we cover that person objectively? It raises so many ethical questions around covering him, have come up in so many conversations every day.
Yeah, it feels like we're ready for the Friday afternoon news dump.
Oh my God.
So we'll be
5
ready for
p.m.
that one.
You're ready to go.
But I did want to switch to the next slide, and then again, this is a graphic content warning, which you're already seeing. A little bit of what we were talking about with covering the administration is international decisions. So I wanted to touch on Victor and Julie's Afghanistan work. So I wanted Julie, can you talk me through that top picture is Julie's picture that made a lot of impact when it was first taken?
Yeah, I'm not sure how well you all can see it because it's a little bit dark because it was rather dark when I shot it. So I was in Afghanistan. This was in 2009, in August of 2009. I was embedded with the Marines in Helmand province, which was like a hot spot in Afghanistan at the time. And the Marines, a few days prior to when this photo was taken, they had assaulted this, basically the Taliban headquarters in this one town, and taken it over, kind of kicked them out of there. Not entirely, but they kicked them out of the headquarters, which was like it was just a house. It was a compound, if you will. All the homes in Afghanistan, they're surrounded by these really high 10, 12-foot walls. So the Marines took over that compound, and then every day they'd go out on these patrols. And this was the one day they went on a patrol, and about an hour before we went out on the patrol, the Taliban had started like shooting mortars at us at the compound. And this patrol had already been scheduled, so they decided, well, we're still going to go. So I went with them, and I knew going out that we were going to make contact. It was just a matter of where, and we knew that if we went another like 500 yards past the marketplace, that they were there because there were drones, up, doing surveillance. But the Taliban also knew that right about sunset is when the air coverage kind of went away because you know, most of the pilots won't fly. They didn't want them flying at night. It was sort of like a risk factor thing. So right about dusk, the shooting starts happening. I hear an explosion and didn't know what it was, followed the Marine I was next to. And it turns out he was one of their trained medics. He was a Marine. Marines don't have their own medics, they use corpsmen. But in this case, they had started training some of the Marines to be medics, and it just so happened that the one I was next to was that. And so I started following him, not really knowing what had happened. And then we came across this one Marine, Corporal Bernard, and he had been, what we determined later was that he had suffered a direct hit from an RPG. And it pretty much kind of went through him. And of course, everybody's shooting back and forth, and it's loud. There's, all kinds of, gunfire going on, and 4 Marines descended upon him to help him. And I couldn't really see exactly what they were doing with him or the complete extent of his injuries. I could tell that one of his legs was, badly wounded or injured, very likely severed. And I went back and looked through the images, sometime later, and I shot about 9 images over the course of like 2.5 minutes. So it wasn't just this quick click, 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 click. I was being very deliberate in what I was photographing. And there are certain rules you follow, certain protocol when it comes to casualties or, anybody killed in action. And he didn't die right then and there. He actually died later on at the hospital at the Camp Leatherneck. But basically, if somebody's injured or killed in action, you cannot report on it for at least 72 hours or until next of kin is notified. And I knew that at the time, but when you're in those situations, it's always shoot first, we'll ask questions later. This picture doesn't have to be published. It can be, but we'll think about it. And so was all of that going through my head? Probably, maybe a little bit, in the back, but it was really just shoot now. And I remember emotionally, I was really kind of sucked into it and didn't notice anything else going on around me. I was down, I had gotten down on my knees, and I was actually shooting on my stomach. And then another RPG went off about like 15 feet from me, and everybody just went quiet. It was like this shell shock, silence, sort of like putting on your Bose headphones and turning on the noise canceling. It was kind of like that. And then everything was white because the walls were all sort of like this adobe. Everything was white from the dust. And then when it finally settled, I heard one of the Marines suddenly realized I was there. And he goes, "Reporter, go get behind the MRAP." And he wasn't upset because I was taking pictures. He just didn't want another casualty. So I got up, did what I was told, and probably like another 10 minutes later, 5 minutes later, they loaded him onto that MRAP, and they like drove him out of there, got him onto a helicopter. So we found out later on that evening that Corporal Bernard died. Now, it was at about a month before we actually published the picture. And in that time, I was still in the embed. And every day, because I don't know when I'm going to be able to charge up my laptop or my phones, I'm not on it for very long. I'm on it long enough to transmit pictures and look at email like really, really quick to make sure there's, just look at the essential stuff. And I would send someone a note once a day or every couple days saying, "Hey, do you know if they're going to publish that picture or not?" And at that time, I thought, it's really important. I thought we really should. At the same time, for the first 3 days, because of the embargo, I didn't say anything to anybody. I didn't tell anybody I had it. I didn't even move the picture. I didn't tell the reporter I had it. I just wanted to let the embargo come and go and then have the discussion. So then I transmitted it with a big note on top saying, "Don't push this out. We need to talk about it." And that's exactly what we did. And so our senior management, they saw the photograph and they decided, let's not just push this picture out. Let's put some context to it. Who was this 21-year-old Marine who died? Who was his family? Where did he come from? Let's find out more about him, and let's find out the circumstances of you know, the battle they were in and why they were there, what's the strategy in Afghanistan. So we went after all of that and, you know, wrote a rather extensive story. They included some of the journals I wrote and journal entries I wrote. Instead of just putting the picture out. So once it was out and I had left the embed like a couple of days before they put the picture out. And I didn't leave the embed because they were putting the picture out. I left the embed because I got really sick. I came down with some virus that was going around the outpost. And I decided, it's time to go. But the Marines, even after the photo came out, they were all like, Julie, you can come back anytime you want. And the command general was like, you know, he basically told them the PIO to tell me sort of like off the record, you know, that, you know, the command general agrees with what you're doing. You know, he wants everybody to see what's going on out here, what it's like. So, you know, we're behind you guys publishing the picture. But yeah, it kind of exploded and I went back to Kabul and, you know, I took my 20-hour nap and woke up to messages from CNN and everybody wanting to talk to me. Everybody was looking for my Facebook page, which did not exist at the time. And I, you know, I stayed in Afghanistan for a few more days, went home, and it was still going on and on. And there were a lot of people upset about it, and a lot of people who were, you know, no, this should, you know, this should have been posted. This should have been released. So is that?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I wanted to touch on now is the evolving view of violence and, you know, what's acceptable. So Victor, you've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. Have you seen an evolution of people's acceptance of graphic images?
It feels like in our wider society, but also in journalism, that we've become increasingly sensitive to and increasingly reluctant to publish photographs of either graphic violence or death, right? And of course, as always in society, photojournalists tend to come in for the most criticism. People tend to project their feelings about an event, about violence, about a movement, whatever, onto the messengers, onto the photojournalists. And it's become I know that I've noticed an increasing kind of reluctance and restriction on publishing graphic images. And I think it says a lot more about our society's kind of dysfunctional relationship with death and violence, right? We tend to kind of still in our news industry rely on a kind of old standard. People don't talk about this too often nowadays, but it used to be called the breakfast test, right? Is it going to make me kind of lose my breakfast? And I understand that picture editors have that role to play, you know, but I do feel like that nowadays, because of social media, because we're also interconnected, that a graphic or a picture, when it splashes across the front page or all over the news, tends to provoke a backlash that news organizations are sensitive to, right? I also think that there are like almost two categories of criticism. There's like the legitimate criticism, and then there's the criticism that feels more kind of partisan or opinion sort of based. I do believe that we maintain an unfair, and I think it's possible to say kind of racist double standard when it comes to images that we publish of graphic violence and death, right? I do think that we're much more comfortable as a society looking at images of violence and death when it happens to marginalized folks, when it happens to Black and brown folks, when it happens to people in the third world. And I think that we're extremely reluctant to publish. That's why Julie's photograph was so powerful when it came out, because it was a depiction of a young U.S. Marine, right? You can't other that person. He's one of us, and that has a real serious impact on an audience. But I also feel like that because these images don't come out as often, we kind of maintain that double standard. And I think the way to get rid of a double standard is not to, you know, I think a lot of the debate is around we need to stop publishing these photographs because they further traumatize, further marginalize communities. Personally, I believe the way out of a double standard is to no longer adhere to it, not to restrict across the board images of graphic violence and death, but to be cognizant of who we publish and who we show in that capacity, you know? So, you know, and we talked about this a couple of years ago, right? The images of COVID, you know, there's a lot of blame to go around for how COVID was covered across the country, and I think most of it lies with the big hospital chains that restricted access to journalists, and with the previous administration that threatened those hospital chains with legal action if they allowed us in. But at the same time, their actions perpetuated the myths that were swirling around the country at the time. And this was not like a right-wing kind of thing. The de Blasio administration did everything it could. The most progressive local government in the country did everything it could to prevent that picture from being taken. I took that picture at the Brooklyn Hospital Center inside a refrigerated truck, right? Every day, photographers who had no access to the hospitals would gather, as we did, outside of hospitals. And the de Blasio administration was going around telling these folks to erect massive barriers, nets, huge plywood walls to prevent us taking pictures from public space, not on private property, of them wheeling the corpses into the refrigerated containers. And I think our audience also reacted negatively to a lot of those pictures. They didn't want to see what was happening. It was too easy at that time to stay cocooned, sequestered in our all kind of COVID bubbles and not deal with, in a real kind of way, what was happening outside of them. So I do think there's been a restriction. I think it's unfortunate. I think it says more about us as a society than it does about than it does about the nature of the pictures. And the other thing for me is it's such a weird kind of dichotomy, because I do feel in the same period of time, culturally, we've become more and more obsessed with true crime podcasts, with murder shows, with the most kind of extreme graphic fictionalized depictions, right? And at the same time, audiences and honestly outlets don't want to publish images like Julie's. So to me, it's a weird kind of, audiences are hungry for this kind of theme, but they also don't want to deal with the reality of it. They want to deal with a fictionalized, kind of sanitized version of it, where there is no grieving family that has to go on for 25 years after the loss of a family member, right? Where there aren't a million dead people from a virus that everybody's in denial about. So I think that our role as photographers is to continue to put that in front of people, to push back against that reluctance, and to keep taking really brave images like this and make sure they get in front of audiences. I think that's our number one role.
Completely agree. And I think it's important to know the US is very different to a lot of other countries in the world in terms of tolerating violent imagery. When I was working in Singapore, you would see, graphic pictures of beheaded bodies from ISIS, victims on the front pages in Asia. You would not see that here ever. This picture is from 2001 in Afghanistan. It's a father hugging his child who'd been killed by a US strike in Afghanistan. And I was on the desk when that picture came in, and I remember thinking, if people saw this picture, the war would stop. How could it not stop? That's 24 years ago, and it's stuck in my head. And there's pictures like Adnan Haj's body on the beach that help change the course of history. But we find ourselves censoring so often for a sanitized audience here. And I think it's our responsibility to make sure that we're showing people what's happening. The COVID coverage, because there wasn't information, it sort of was fertile ground for misinformation. The number of people that came back to us after we had photographed in a Texas hospital saying, this isn't true, this person didn't die, they've got blood on their body bag, that is not a virus. It's like, what are you talking about? But, we've got to be the ones that provide the images that people have the information on. And, this is why everybody pushing for access is really, really important. And we've got to keep that fight going. So can we switch to the next one, right?
Could I just add one quick thing, just in terms from a publishing perspective?
Yeah.
Because we do, as editors, myself and my colleagues, whether it's at the Post or the Times, whenever photographers or the wire services move, graphic images, we do have conversations around it. We do bring these things to editors' attention, and we do weigh, what is the impact of this image in print versus how is it going to impact on digital? And now I would say, from a publishing perspective, that has been the challenge. That is always a challenge, and that has been the challenge. But I would also remind you all that please continue to send those pictures. Please continue to let editors know what's happening on the ground, because it is important for us to have those conversations with the final decider editors on what we're going to show and how we're going to show it. But there are conversations that happen around it.
For sure. So now we get into the royal family, a little different to Afghanistan, but I'm sure you guys all know this, possibly the story behind the Kate Middleton photoshopped picture, which for all of us, maybe not for Victor, has become a real headache. But I want to first of all go to Julie and say, how has this shaped how you pick up handouts, how you look at the royal family's output?
Well, yes, we definitely take a second look at everything now. We always have to begin with, but you get comfortable, and then something like this happens, and then you realize, okay, we can't be comfortable. We have to really kind of look at these things in details. And yeah, it takes time. It takes up time to do it. It's really annoying. That's in a very brief way to have to do that. It's very disappointing too. Especially when you're dealing with with a source or an organization like the royal family. You would like to believe that they're being professional about things, but then you have to remember, especially who they are. They have this image, and they've been brought up that way to maintain a certain image, right? So situations like this, you have to be on your guard even more as a journalist, as an editor, looking at things. We pick up UGC a lot, especially for breaking news, and we vet those things very carefully. All the way down to, is this really the source of the photograph, the person who posted it, and you have to vet those all the way, up and down. If we can't confirm the source, we don't publish it. We don't put it out there. But yes, it's definitely, and it brings up the whole thing of it. It brings up AI and the future of photojournalism, because programs like Photoshop are just going to get even more sophisticated and easier for people to do things like that. And we have to continue to kill things when that happens, because it allows us also to educate the public that this is not okay. It's fine for your scrapbook, but it's not okay for journalism, because if it's not real, then it's not credible. And then how do you know that your news is, in what we're telling you, is credible, right? I mean, that it's factual, not just made up. So, I mean, I think every wire service that ran this obviously killed it, just like we did, for the exact reasons that we're talking about now. But yeah, AI, that's all going to be, I mean, we're all under discussions with that now, with all the software companies, with even the camera companies that provide them to us, professionally, and how to get past, or at least how to work through it and work with it, because it's not going away.
Quick poll on AI. Do you think it's a threat to the industry, or do you think it's an opportunity for real journalism to shine? Sandra.
Why are you looking at me? Initially, I would say I thought perhaps it could be a threat. However, I think it's important to understand the technology. I think, for the Post at least, we found ways to, aside from the visual part of it, we have made a choice that we will not use any images that are AI to illustrate any stories. We have a hard and fast policy on that. However, we do think it's our job to report on the technology, to report on its usage. And, us, along with other news organizations, have found ways to sort of harness AI from a word perspective, not, again, not an image perspective. Do I think it's a threat? I would imagine when Photoshop first came out, people probably saw that as a threat, to the darkroom, and then it, killed the darkroom in a way. But I think, the more that people understand the technology, I think that's what's most important.
Victor, what about you?
Existential. existential threat. I don't think it. I think I follow the coverage of AI and where it's going. I think that it's generally driven by capital markets more than anything, and I think it's a solution without a problem. I think that there's a lot of capital behind it, pushing AI into realms that it doesn't serve anyone, doesn't need to be, in order to kind of give it a better toehold in our everyday lives, so we're more ready to accept its further encroachment. I honestly look forward to kind of a debate around it that's outside of journalism or writing. I'm looking forward to a debate about a kind of, what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be creative? What does it mean to make things that weren't there before? And I appreciate the Post and National Geographic's come out with a very strong AI policy, which I think is great for journalism. I would like to see other organizations do that. I've been dismayed at the reluctance for that, because I think folks are still kind of, as you said, looking for ways that it can help their report, help their newsroom. But I'm looking forward to a discussion, a kind of broader discussion about like what are our kind of human values and which ones are contravened by reliance on artificial intelligence.
What about you, Julie?
I like what you said there about, it's the whole existential part of it. But we do have to be careful with it. But I do think that, I know AP has used AI to write like these little sports briefs or create charts, based on statistics and things like that, things that would save time. But as far as documentary photojournalism goes, at least traditionally, I don't know that I see it as a threat so much, as long as we stay on top of it and don't give up. Don't give in, like you guys have created these policies. I do see, the way that journalism, the whole news, the way people take in their news now is going to be more of an experience. We don't just read it anymore. I think it's going to be sort of more around us every day, whether you're sitting at home, working from home, or in your workspace. If you go to an office, if you look at Meta's, the wearables and how you can sort of like be like Tony Starks and just flip through things. I think people are going to be able to do that with their news. And I think, as long as we, stay on top of things and make sure we, the reality of what we create is maintained and that nothing is inserted. I mean, there's no difference in making an actual black and white print and going, oh crap, I blew out the sky a little bit. Let me take this charcoal pencil and just kind of add a little bit of tone in there, or turning the print upside down and putting it under hot water to create a little bit more tone in the sky. There's no difference in that and going into Photoshop and pulling down the highlights, is there? So when we're talking about AI, it's, and all these, especially with quantum computers and the speed that everything's going to be going, and this is all being developed, and all these, trillions of experiments have already been done with computers. It's not going away. So you either adapt to it and find a way to allow it to help you do your journalism in ways that doesn't compromise it. So I don't think I see it as a threat. I think we can welcome it, sort of like keep your enemies close. As long as you understand it and you stay on top of it, you can control it.
And I think we just have to be, as news organizations, it's important that we're transparent about it. Transparent in the coverage, transparent in how we're using it. I do think the Post has been very transparent in, how we're using AI with our climate questions. And I think we just introduced another AI bot, to the arena. But I think as long as we're really transparent about why we're using it and how we're using it from a journalism perspective, I think that is very important.
For sure. Ryan, can we go to the next one and tell me how we're doing on time? We're okay? Okay. Okay, so we wanted to touch on consent and privacy and things like that, which is a big issue that really, I think, came to the forefront probably in 2020. I mean, it was around before that, obviously, but I feel like 2020 is when people really talked a lot about it during the protests. So Victor, I'm going to go to you about how do you navigate this on the streets.
Well, covering those protests was an intense kind of moment for the country, and it became a sort of intense moment for the photographers who were there on multiple sides, because you were kind of like getting it from every side. So it was a very strange moment. It felt like being there felt like looking out at the rest of the country that wasn't going out every day with you, that people had kind of lost control of their critical faculties, that people were kind of adopting positions that you were like, wait, you wouldn't have thought this kind of a couple minutes ago. So it was one of those like kind of hinge moments for the country. It was very intense. And quite quickly we began to get kind of pushback against depicting the faces of protesters, because there was an idea out there that we were somehow operating on behalf of law enforcement or security services by depicting protesters. And then there were folks that were talking about we need to blur faces. And then there were some photographers who like kind of claim or adopted the position where I'm going to shoot people like from the neck down. There's a variety of kind of positions on that. My position personally is that, I'm unwilling to do any of those things. That we live in part of what makes protest possible is that we live in a free and open society. The open space that we kind of take for granted at this point. One of the few things that kind of helps to preserve that is photojournalism, right? We're the ones pushing to keep public space, public debate open. And there's a real debate to have about public versus private space. But I'll say an interesting thing that happened for me. I think a lot of these arguments are often motivated by a kind of bleed over from people's kind of personal, often political perspective, and then trying to graft that onto their journalism, right? And I'll just go ahead and make an unpopular claim. I strive to adopt an ideal of objectivity in my reporting. I know that's increasingly unpopular in the culture, but that's the standard that I aspire to. And as part of that, I thought it was quite interesting, and a double standard kind of raised its head quite quickly when really just 6 months later, I got a ton of approbation about photographs I made in Minneapolis from various different kind of sides of the debate or sides of and parts of our society. And then all of a sudden, and one of the main ones, I had people call me up, take my picture down from the New York Times. You showed my face, blah, blah, blah. I said, that's not how it works. You were in public protesting, and that's what we do, But no one ever told me to take down a picture of a police officer. No one ever told me to take down a picture of a security service. And literally no one asked me to take down pictures or blur faces of people who entered the Capitol on January 6th, right? And so that became for me a very clear sort of kind of signal that the impetus for this was coming from a place that wasn't concerned with journalism, wasn't concerned with an open society, wasn't concerned with history, wasn't concerned with accuracy. It was concerned with a certain political perspective, with a kind of, and even a kind of personal affinity for, right, the what we would call the protesters or resistance, however you want to call that. It doesn't matter what my personal affinity for is in the street. It doesn't matter what side I'm on. In fact, the thing that makes me a professional is I'm able to go into the street and navigate that situation without being on any particular side. That's the foundation of my credibility, and my credibility is the currency that I transaction in. That's all I have, and I have to maintain that credibility, right? I had folks for this particular photograph, I had lawyers for those folks reach out to me and ask for my outtakes because they sued the Minneapolis Police Department over that moment. And I had to refuse to, for the exact same reason that I refuse subpoenas from law enforcement, because I have to play both sides equally. I can't have, I find myself oftentimes, like my colleagues here, photographing situations of, divisive, polarizing, extreme events that we have to maintain our credibility as good faith interlocutors for the rest of our society that can't be there. And the minute that I compromise that by giving photographs to one side but not to the other in order to help their legal claims, then I've compromised that positionality. I've compromised that objectivity. So that's how I navigate it.
I think it's perfectly said, Victor. I wanted to show this picture from Julia Rendelman of two ballerinas on a Confederate statue in Richmond. And when we posted this picture on our Instagram, we got so many comments for how dare you show these girls, and we had named them, and you should take down their identity, they're in danger. And the girls wanted their names out there. They wanted to take back this power of this Confederate statue. And I found it super interesting that people who didn't know them were making decisions for them. And because of this picture, they started a whole foundation about Black ballerinas, and it was a super empowering moment. So I just wanted to add that one for, a bit of an idea of people making decisions for other people. But I think Victor said it perfectly. So we're going to go to the next slide. And I'm sure there will be discussions about consent and things later as well. Okay, so this was sort of a cropping example. This is a very, photo-related image in that this is the picture that it moved on the wire, and it had very little impact when it was sent like that. The next day, we went back and cropped this photo. This is from Gaza. It's taken by Mohammed Salam. It won the World Press Photo of the Year. It was part of our Pulitzer entry, which was also the winner. But as a vertical image, this picture resonated globally. It's become emblematic of the war in Gaza. And I think it's super interesting that the difference of the impact of one photo, it's the same photo, it's just cropped differently. So it's how you impact people, audience, how people sort of navigate to pictures. So I wanted to touch on this to lead to the impact slide, which I think is the next one, which is what a lot of us want to do here is impact the wider population with the information that we're giving them. So Victor, I'm going to go to you again with your Afghanistan coverage, if that's okay. On impact, you and a very few amount of photojournalists were there on the ground to show the impact of the decision to withdraw U.S. troops then.
Yeah, we were asked to kind of pick a photograph that we've made that had a lot of impact, and I feel like this is one in the last few years that I made that had a lot of impact. It was and the impact of it sort of resonated outward in strange ways, but I'm a little at a loss for words of what to say about it. Kind of, the circumstances of it. I was in Afghanistan. We knew that the country was. The Taliban was gaining momentum. The country was going to fall. I was there about a month before that. The Taliban was, making their way towards Kabul very rapidly over I was at dinner parties 10 days before this where people were like, oh, it'll take a year and a half for them to get to Kabul. And they were there in literally days. And so the news organizations, every Western news organization except for Agence France Presse, evacuated their entire operation out of Kabul. And myself and about, a small group of people, about 6-7 Western journalists, made the decision that we thought we could stay and cover it, and we didn't pull out. And I was on assignment for publication. They demanded that I leave. I said, guys, love you guys. No, I'm going to stay. I'm going to surf this. We're going to figure this out. And so we stayed. And I think me and Jim were the only ones who actually photographed the Taliban entering the city on August 15th. And it was the kind of thing, my buddy Andrew Quilty was mainly responsible for this. Me and him were riding around together. But at the end of the day, it was a lifetime of preparation, a career. This was 20 years almost 20 years I've been photographing. It was that prepared me to be ready to do that. And the thing that was crazy was the way it immediately, the impact wise, real quick, was immediately these folks pulled into town and we started shooting their photographs, and no one laid us on the ground, chopped our heads off, right? We were immediately walking around talking to these guys, trying to navigate a very, very chaotic situation. And the scales kind of fell from our eyes. And I feel like that front page photograph suddenly kind of turned the finger back to our political and military leaders who had prosecuted this war for 20 years, told us who these guys were, what they were all about, and the reasons that we had to keep killing people day in and day out, the reasons we had to keep on, launching airstrikes, committing drone attacks. The reason we had to keep the pressure on was because these bloodthirsty killers were going to come for you in your home. And all of a sudden we took this picture and went around the world, and it was like, you guys lied to us. You've been lying to us for 20 years. What else are you lying to us about this conflict? So that was the gratifying thing for me.
It's a huge amount of impact for one photograph, and it's like we said before, if you're not there, then people don't know. Julie, is there an AP picture that you think about and go like the impact of that picture?
Well, there's a lot of AP photos out there. I mean, I can only speak, to the one we discussed earlier, because that one, I remember that time that the U.S. was trying to decide whether or not to send more troops in. And Bernard's father, he was retired, but he had been like a first sergeant in the Marines. He had been on his own campaign to try to influence the strategy that was going on in Afghanistan, which was basically to send these little patrols out and sort of wait for the Taliban to strike, and which wasn't really very successful. And after that incident, when that photograph came out, it took a couple of months, but we started getting the idea that Bernard's father started realizing that picture, did have that impact and had drawn their focus to the strategy and how they were doing things. And I think it was November when they decided to go ahead and push more troops there. Whether that was right or wrong, I'm not going to speak to that. But that incident it was just coincidental that it happened during that time when the Secretary of Defense was trying to make this decision whether or not to send more troops back out, into Afghanistan, because it had become this forgotten war. Because Iraq, it was just all Iraq all the time, and even the soldiers in Afghanistan would have told you, everybody forgotten about us. Nobody knows what we're doing out here. They don't even know we're here. And then things just kind of turned around from there. So yeah, to me, I would say, at least for me, that photograph that I shot, that it did have quite a bit of impact. There was no shortage of discussion about ethics, whether I should have shot it, what my role, in that situation was, whether I should have helped him, whether I, all the reasons why I shot it, and there was no shortage of discussion. And those are things that you all can discuss amongst yourselves as well, in your classes or with your friends, because you're going to be in those situations, when you're out there shooting. Should I have helped him? Well, if it had just been me and him, yes. But since he had 4 Marines on him and helping him, and I had been told, multiple times, if anything happens, stay out of our way, you do your job, you let us do ours. No, I shouldn't have helped him. I probably could have messed things up if I had stepped in there. So, there's a lot of reasons to why we do what we do. Should I have shot it? I've said this before. Yes, I should have, and, I've been told, is it all just for the freedom of the press? No, it's for your need to know what you should know. War is a very public act. Okay, it's not a private thing where somebody's dying in their bed at home from cancer, surrounded by family. It's we as a people sent him to war. Okay, so shouldn't you know whether you agreed with the war or not? Doesn't matter. As a country, we're sending these people to war. They are going to die. You should know that. So, that's, to me, that had the greatest amount of impact.
Yeah, I think you guys give great examples of huge impact on policy decisions. And there's some examples of sort of the smaller impact. There's a picture that was taken on Hart Island in New York City of the mass graves during the COVID crisis. And it really wasn't until AP and Reuters went out together, which doesn't happen that often, but they did. And they both had drone pictures of these mass graves of unidentified bodies, unclaimed bodies. And because of those pictures, de Blasio was at that time forced to admit that there was mass graves being dug on Hart Island, and it gave family members 2 more weeks to claim the bodies of their loved ones. And it illuminated a crisis here as well. So, the impact levels can be different, but I think that's what we always strive for.
Yes, de Blasio also got the NYPD to turn on their drone net, and anytime somebody put a drone up there, they were cited and their drone was confiscated after that. So
Just a real quick correction. I said that me and Jim, but it's me, Jim, and Andrew Quilty, all three photographed that day. Just make sure that everybody knows.
So Sandra, do you want to talk through the impact of this one?
Sure. So impact can also be just on everyday lives. And the top 3 photos, you know, we had an opportunity to cover Black maternal health situation in Texas. You know, this of course was last year and before, you know, all of the laws and debates had happened. You know, basically for Black women in America, giving birth is quite dangerous. Access to quality health care is extremely dangerous. And we were able to work with a midwife, a Black midwife, who wanted to reach all women of all socioeconomic backgrounds to provide them with quality care. And, you know, this particular story, you know, as simple as it looks, it is quite complicated. And it, believe it or not, it still opens debate in terms of what type of images are we going to publish. It makes us think about representation, even representation in the Afghanistan pictures. In any of the pictures, I think representation actually comes into play in conversation. But with this particular story, what I loved about it is it rose to a level of acknowledging what women need and what women continue to need and what their basic rights are. You know, Jahi Shakundu was the photographer on this, and he photographed for like 2 weeks, maybe a little bit more than 2 weeks, but it shows the importance and, you know, his ability to really get in with the subjects, to really get in with the women, and to bring, you know, this story to life, which, you know, we thought was impactful and important. You know, the second group of photos, or the 2 photos, were taken by Salwan Georges. And it's actually a part 2. The Post published a series looking at what happened to the brains at the Smithsonian. And, you know, because of the first investigative piece that Salwan photographed, you know, the Smithsonian returned this family the brain of a loved one. And so to me, it's not just about how powerful the photos are, it's also how powerful the story is. And I think, you know, you can have a great photo, but you gotta have the story. The story needs to be, you know, told through the images, through the subject, and how you get into, you know, a community.
Yeah, and that's a great example of real impact. So I wanted to open it up for questions. I'm sure you all have a lot. Yes. Okay. Actually, before we do that, just a round of applause for the panel.
Yeah, is it working? Okay, cool. First of all, thank you guys for all coming and speaking today. This is awesome. It's technically 2 questions, but they both relate to the same issue. So you guys talked a lot about physical security. Over the summer, I went to a CPJ panel last year. There was a data breach at the New York Times. The AT&T had a massive data breach which tied up phone numbers, and there was questions if that would burn sources for journalists. I was curious if you guys could speak to how digital security might play a role, and especially Victor, I know you're working in the field kind of with sensitive subject matter, and how you protect subjects and sources in that regard. And the second question more relates to, I recall kind of when photojournalists are being kind of targeted on social media, an issue that comes to mind was, I believe it was Evelyn Hochstein's photos with the NRA convention, and kind of the immediate pushback to this particular image. And I was curious if you could talk about kind of how editors stand by their photographers and kind of deal with that pushback. Thank you so much.
I'll let Victor go first on digital security.
I find digital security to be a real challenge, especially in our kind of like melded laptop phone accounts. And honestly, you know, we've done it. We have some digital security guidance at some of my clients that work with us. The New York Times gives us some guidance. We have kind of a couple little gadgets we use and a couple little apps we use, but I find it really hard to secure, my like messaging apps and stuff, and the truth is there's not, unless you're going to go full like Edward Snowden, like that kind of ultra security. I don't work on those kind of things, right? I'm not carrying around actionable intelligence. I'm not carrying around, anything that anyone could use to like catch somebody or blow somebody up or something, right? So, and as a photographer, I kind of have that luxury. If I was a national security reporter, I'd have a little bit different profile. And basically I try to be as like transparent as possible, I do have a delete me account, which I think is helpful. Kind of less, I'm less worried about being doxxed than I am just like sick of the constant surveillance of Amazon, all these companies pushing ads to me all the time. But the doxing thing is a concern, but really I think I wish someone would come up with a better answer for that. Because if somebody puts a gun to your head and tells you to type the password into your phone, you're going to do it, And at this point, unfortunately, I feel like our kind of digital devices are so key to our reporting, that it's hard to kind of totally eschew them. Sometimes I'll leave it at home. Sometimes I've tried to figure out a good way to keep a kind of blank phone, and I haven't figured that out yet. Because once you load the apps on it, everything's on it, So it's like, well, okay, now what? I think it is a challenge, but a delete me account is one thing. I'm also just very careful about what I post. There's all the time. Every day I scroll through Twitter and some moron says something ridiculous that I want to shoot my mouth off about, and I stop myself. Right? I don't comment. I don't engage in the debate because it compromises my perspective, my position in the debate. Right? And it's vital to me that I maintain that. So a little bit of restraint helps me out as well.
I wish a lot of people would listen to Victor and copy that, because
Yes.
I spend a lot of my time talking people down from fights on Twitter and Instagram that are really not beneficial to them. But a little bit of background with the Evelyn story. She took a picture at the NRA convention last year of a 9-year-old pointing a gun at her. She got his name. She had spoken to his grandfather. And this picture went out. It became super viral. Fox spoke to the grandfather, and he had told them that she set it up, which was not true. She actually told him to take the gun down from pointing it at her. Anyway, so the Fox News story went out. The NRA retweeted the Fox story and said, "Meet Evelyn Hochstein, who set up this photo." Anyway, so luckily we have a whole Reuters mechanism in place behind us. We get the ethics team involved, the legal team involved, the security team involved, and that includes digital security. We made sure her Instagram was private. She had posted it on her own Instagram as well. And I had posted it on the main Reuters account, and we're way happier for all the heat to come to the main Reuters account. But this one also crossed over into her physical safety because somebody posted her address. So we had to get her to a hotel that night. And it was incredibly scary. This is an armed group targeting one of our photographers. And now we had already had policies around getting consent for children, and we followed that guidance there, and now we're like, maybe we don't name the children in these situations. But it was really scary, and Reuters wrote a story and put out statements pushing back on the Fox News story, and this is why it's really good to work with photographers who sign up to an ethical code, so that they haven't set up that picture. I 1000% know Evelyn did not do that. So we can fully get behind them, and that's what's important across the board as well. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
As someone who's kind of like fresh into college, I'm a freshman studying photography right now, and I'm into photojournalism. How do you recommend I go with getting internships and like setting myself up for a future in photojournalism with like bigger companies and stuff?
Sandra, I'll let you take that one.
Definitely internships. I would definitely, I believe NYU has their own publication. I would get involved in that. I would also, I would also look to small community media here in the city. There are tons of them. Whether it's the Haitian Times, they're always looking for visuals. The Mott Haven up in the Bronx, they're always looking for photographers to photograph things. Any way to get exposure. The city, although I think they may have cut back, but I think those avenues can be really helpful. And also keeping an eye on the affinity journalism groups, particularly for students. They also have visual task forces that you can be a part of and network with. And, if you're even thinking about going overseas at some point, as an international photographer, I would try to get yourself involved with the Overseas Press Club America, which has a student, admission or a student membership price, and the Online News Association, which also thinks about the future of journalism, not just also in a technology way. So those are all great networking, great opportunities for you to think about, how to position yourself moving forward.
Yeah. Any other questions? I saw one over here. There was one over here earlier. No, Kira?
Thank you. This has been really great panel and really interesting. This question is for Julie, and I just wanted to ask Julie, other than the picture that you took of this soldier that was killed in Afghanistan, do you know of any other pictures like that that were published anywhere during the war when U.S. was in Afghanistan, of a U.S. soldier that was killed?
Oh gosh.
I just said, I asked if, other than Julie's picture of the soldier that was killed in Afghanistan, if Julie was aware, or if any of you are aware of any other pictures of a soldier that was killed of a U.S. soldier killed in Afghanistan published in the press.
In Afghanistan, killed that was published? No. I do know that we published other photographs. I would say, I think it was a couple of years later. One of our photographers was on embed, took these amazing photographs of this soldier who was wounded on a helicopter. Just, I mean, it was pretty graphic. He was, he had been wounded in his neck. It was bloody, and the way he was holding himself, the emotion, the expression on his face, it was almost like he was waking up from a dream. It was, it was a beautiful photograph, and how powerful it was. He didn't die, but I know that we held on to it for a little bit, and then we went ahead and published it. There was some other news happening at the time, and I cannot recall specifically what, but it was some kind of international news that it sort of didn't make it to the top as it would have. But I remember the soldier ended up, living, and made contact with the photographer some months later, and she actually went and visited him it was in the DC area. He was at home. He was healing up, but I know we've had from Afghanistan. I would say no, and my memory is really fuzzy, but I know that there have been, past conflicts where there have been photos of U.S. soldiers published. You can look back to World War II. On Life magazine when that's, but at that time the war was going well, and so it was sort of like this heroic, courageous photo. That was the impact that it had back then. And I think Victor, you talked about this a little bit. Depending on where things are going, people are going to interpret pictures like that differently.
I think the Times, not Afghanistan, but Iraq, seems to, for whatever reason, keeps popping into my head when Michelle McNally initially joined the Times. And I want to say that there were soldiers who were hanged, and my understanding was there was a huge conversation about, yeah, whether we should publish that or not, and they chose to. For some reason, I too have Afghanistan. It's sort of like left my mind, but I keep seeing, remembering Iraq on front pages.
Mike Camber published an important photo of a dead U.S. soldier in Iraq as well. World Press photo winning picture. And Mike Camber also did some important work, journalistic work, reporting on the kind of taboos and the unspoken taboos around publishing photographs of U.S. service members. And I think Julie's experience with the battalion commander, or was it regimental commander, who kind of reached out to you and said he was behind you, is not uncommon. But there's so many layers of public affairs, or so many political layers involved that as Mike documented, photographers who did publish images of dead U.S. service members were almost universally not welcome to continue covering in the kind of embed program. And the embed program is a whole nother, we could have a whole panel about that. Let's not get into that now. Might be.
Sorry, I think that Julie's picture is the only picture in that war. I mean, you students should check this, but in my experience, I mean, from what I've seen, I think that Julie has the only picture. I mean, it's a terrible thing but for all the years that the U.S. military was in that war and U.S. soldiers were killed, there were no pictures in the press of that. And that is a question, I think, that has to do with embed. And the ethics, I think, for sure, around that, because definitely there were pictures made of soldiers that were killed in Afghanistan.
That's very possible, but at the same time, you have to also consider that there weren't embeds in every single, say, company or that were spread throughout Afghanistan, and so a lot of that would just be happenstance. There were all kinds of really kinetic areas of Afghanistan up in the northeast or the eastern region, where there were constant skirmishes every day. Because they would come and they would hit you every day. They'd come by on their little motorcycles and they'd take shots at the post, and then they'd run off. They'd take off, and nothing really happened. Or there'd be these little mini ambushes, sometime during the day, but it would depend on if there was an actual journalist with them or not. And I'm not going to say that nothing else was ever photographed, because maybe there was, and the person decided, opted out of, sending, passing it along to editors.
I do know that I know of photographers who photographed dead U.S. service members who their news agencies did not move the pictures. I saw them like on their laptops, and also the thing that's kind of hard to understand, I think people don't quite get about doing the kind of thing Julie was doing, is like the amount of effort it takes, the amount of logistical support, the amount of effort, the amount of journalistic know-how, and then the amount of bravery it takes to walk outside the wire like that it's incalculable. And I don't know about you, my experience is always you get all the way out there and then something actually, because 90% of the days you go, not 90, depends where you were in Helmand, it was every day, but then the shooting starts and you're like, oh my God, what did I get myself into? Why am I out here? But the amount of effort it takes to get to a forward position and actually document the application of violence it's an incredible amount of effort. And you have to go up against roadblock after roadblock of people preventing you from being in the place where that violence is happening. So it's next to impossible to even get in that position. And then to have the wherewithal to make the picture in that position that's why so few of them exist.
I think we're probably at time, right, Ryan? But thank you to the panelists, and I'm hopeful they might stick around for something to eat if you want to have a chat with them. So thank you.